Ridgefield was a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other, and most things never seemed to change. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the dusty streets. The old gun store, tucked between two brick buildings, had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows were covered in faded signs that advertised rifles, shotguns, and other hunting gear. The place was a relic of the town's rugged past. Inside the store, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of wood, metal, and old leather. A group of men were standing near the counter, talking loudly about the upcoming hunting season. They were all regulars, farmers, ranchers, and hunters, their faces weathered and worn from years of hard work and long days in the field. They had seen it all: wild animals, bad weather, and the kind of hardship that made a person tough. Their conversation drifted from the best spots for deer hunting to which rifle was the most reliable. Their laughter echoed in the quiet store, but then the door creaked open and a new presence filled the room. A young woman walked in. She was tall, with short, dark hair that framed her face, and her leather jacket hung loosely over her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp and observant, scanning the shelves of guns and ammunition that lined the walls. There was something about her that made the men stop talking. Maybe it was the fact that she looked so out of place in a store like this, or maybe it was the way she moved with quiet confidence. The bell above the door jingled again as she stepped in, and the men exchanged uncertain glances. This was not a place where women usually came, especially not ones so young. Ridgefield was full of old traditions, and women were not often seen in the local gun store. Most of the women in town preferred to shop for clothes, groceries, or spend time with their families. But this woman, she was different. She didn't stop to make small talk. She didn't look at the men who were now eyeing her. She simply walked toward the counter, her eyes fixed on the display of rifles in front of her. She had a clear purpose, and that alone set her apart. One of the men, a heavy-set man named Greg, who had spent most of his life hunting in the mountains, cleared his throat. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice loud and thick with suspicion. The woman looked at him and smiled politely. "I'm looking for a specific model," she said calmly, her voice steady and confident. Greg raised an eyebrow. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering for just a moment too long. "You sure you're old enough to even handle a gun?" he asked, his tone not exactly welcoming. "I don't think this is the place for you." There was a subtle shift in the room. The other men who had been laughing and talking moments ago now fell quiet. They glanced over, noticing how young she was. They had heard of women in other towns who could shoot just as well as any man. But in Ridgefield, this was rare. Greg's words were more of a challenge than a question. The woman didn't flinch. She simply turned to him, still with that polite smile. "I know what I'm doing," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I've been shooting since I was a child." The room remained silent. It was clear that the men didn't believe her. There was something about her presence that didn't match the image they had in their minds of a gun owner. To them, guns were tools of strength, of survival, and they had never seen a woman walk into their store with the same kind of confidence they had. The idea that she could be knowledgeable about firearms seemed impossible to them. Another man, a younger one named Pete, spoke up. He was new to town and had only been living in Ridgefield for a few months, but he had already learned enough to know that people here were quick to judge. Still, he couldn't help but ask, "What's a young woman like you doing here?" "You don't seem like the hunting type." The woman's eyes met his, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of something in them, something intense, something that told Pete that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. She stepped closer to the counter, ignoring the men behind her. "I'm buying a gun because I need one," she said simply, without any hint of pride or arrogance in her voice. "Not because I'm trying to prove anything." Pete watched her for a second longer, wondering if she was lying. He had spent enough time around Ridgefield to know how things worked. People didn't come into this store unless they were serious. Still, there was something about her demeanor that made him question the assumptions he had made about her. She continued to browse the rifles, her fingers lightly grazing the polished wood and cold steel. She knew exactly what she wanted. Her gaze didn't linger on any other model. She went straight to a display of long-range rifles, each one more expensive and powerful than the last. She picked up one of them, examining it carefully. The men at the counter continued to watch, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed laughter. They were certain she would never buy anything. They were sure she would leave as quickly as she came, defeated by their teasing. After all, no one in Ridgefield had ever seen a woman buy a weapon from this store, but the young woman didn't seem to notice their mocking looks. She was focused on the rifle in her hands as if she had done this 100 times before. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she looked up and addressed the man behind the counter, a quiet but firm request on her lips. "I'd like to buy this one," she said, her voice steady. Greg and the others froze. They didn't know what to say. The woman, young and unassuming, had asked for the most expensive model in the store. They had expected her to back down, to realize that this was not a place for someone like her. But instead she had stood her ground. She wasn't intimidated by their glances or their whispered jokes. She knew what she wanted and she was going to get it. The tension in the store grew thick. The other men looked at each other, unsure of what to do. They had no idea that this young woman was about to show them something they had never seen before. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft ticking of an old clock hanging above the counter. The men stared at the young woman, still unsure whether she was serious. They exchanged quick glances, their skepticism lingering in the air. She was confident, sure of herself, but they weren't sure if she could back it up. Just as the tension seemed to grow unbearable, the bell above the door rang again, signaling someone else's arrival. All heads turned as the heavy wooden door creaked open, and the tall figure of an older man stepped in. His boots were worn but polished, his cowboy hat perched firmly atop his head. His face, lined with age, spoke of countless years spent under the sun. He was none other than Jack Edwards, the owner of the store, a man who commanded respect not only because of his age but because of his reputation. The men in the room instinctively straightened up as Jack walked in. He was a fixture in Ridgefield, a man who knew how to handle a rifle as well as anyone, if not better. He had spent his life in the wilds, surviving with nothing but his wits and his weapons. He was feared by many and respected by all. Jack paused for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The men at the counter immediately fell silent, their usual banter dying in an instant. He walked toward the young woman without hesitation, his steps purposeful. He was not one to waste time on pleasantries, and he certainly wasn't going to make small talk about the weather. The young woman, standing with the rifle in her hands, turned to face him. There was no surprise in her expression. She had expected him to arrive soon. Everyone in Ridgefield knew when Jack Edwards showed up, things got serious. "Ma'am," Jack said, his voice low and respectful, as he nodded to the young woman in front of him. His gaze lingered on the rifle she had chosen, but it was the way he addressed her that made the entire room go still. The men's mouths fell open, unable to process what they were hearing. Jack Edwards, the owner of the store, had just called this young woman Ma'am. And not only that, he had addressed her with the kind of respect that was usually reserved for the most experienced and respected hunters in town. For a brief moment, the room was completely silent. The men who had been mocking the woman just moments before now found themselves unsure of what to say. They stared at each other, their eyes wide with confusion. Jack had been running the store for years and no one had ever seen him act like this. He was never one to hand out respect easily, let alone to someone who looked so young and inexperienced. The young woman met Jack's gaze without flinching. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice steady and polite. Jack smiled slightly. "I see you found yourself a fine rifle," he said, glancing at the weapon in her hands. His tone was approving, and it was clear from the way he spoke that he didn't think less of her for her age or gender. In fact, he seemed genuinely pleased that she had chosen the rifle. The men behind the counter, who had been so quick to judge her, were now looking at each other, uncertain how to react. They had thought they were the only ones who understood weapons, the only ones who knew what it took to handle them. But here was Jack Edwards, the most seasoned gun owner in town, treating this woman with the same respect he gave to any of the most experienced hunters. "What's your name, miss?" Jack asked, his eyes softening slightly. "Isabel," the young woman replied. "Isabel Turner," Jack nodded. "Isabel, I'm glad to see that the younger generation is still interested in these old ways. We could use more people like you, someone who knows what they're doing." The men in the room were speechless. They had assumed that Isabel was just another city girl who had no idea how to handle a weapon, but now they realized that they had completely misjudged her. And worse, they had underestimated someone who had earned the respect of the store owner himself. As Jack turned to go to the back room to fetch the rifle Isabel had asked for, The men slowly began to speak again. Though their words were cautious now, they were all too aware of how wrong they had been. Never thought I'd see the day. One man muttered under his breath, shaking his head. I should have known better, another said quietly. Jack doesn't give respect to just anyone. Isabel stood quietly at the counter, her heart beating a little faster now. She had always known that there were people who doubted her because of her age and her gender, but today Jack's unexpected salute to her had given her something more. Validation. In a town like Ridgefield, where tradition ran deep and outsiders were often met with skepticism, she had earned a place among those who truly understood the value of what they were doing. A few minutes later, Jack returned with the rifle in hand, holding it carefully. He set it on the counter in front of Isabel, his hands steady and sure. Here you go, ma'am, he said, his tone warm, almost fatherly. Isabel took the rifle from him, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. She had trained for this moment for years. She had learned how to shoot from her father, a man who had taught her the value of self-reliance and the importance of knowing how to protect herself. The rifle wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of independence and strength. And in Ridgefield it carried a weight that no one could ignore. Jack stepped back, his eyes scanning the room once more. The men were still standing around the counter, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He took one last look at them and nodded his approval. I'll leave you all to your business, he said, his voice cool but carrying an unmistakable edge. But remember this. Don't judge people by their age or appearance. Some things go deeper than that. As Jack made his way toward the back of the store, the men were left standing there, slowly coming to terms with their own mistakes. They had thought that they could dismiss Isabel, that they could reduce her to nothing more than a young woman who didn't belong in a place like this. But now they understood the truth. Respect had to be earned, not given based on appearances. Isabel stood at the counter, rifle in hand, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. She had not only walked into that store and asked for the rifle she wanted, but she had also shown the men that they had been wrong about her. She was not a mere outsider. She was someone who deserved respect, and Jack Edwards had given her that respect. And in doing so, he had made her feel that she truly belonged.